let me just begin by thanking you all for being here. This is the first in a series of environmental films, and I think it's a good way to kick off the series because it certainly gave me an awful lot to think about. I tried to look at it from the perspective of a literary critic, to look at the narrative and how it was put together and what how it invited us to respond. And it was, for me, it was problematic. It was a fragmented film with a series of separate narratives, beginning with the view inside the factory, going through different stages of industrialization, and always coming back to the impact on China. And at the end, I think the filmmaker tried to make a very clear case for presenting these images objectively, which I don't believe in as a literary critic, but it was very clear that the filmmaker was making a strong effort to represent rather than construct, or to record rather than construct. I think there's a kind of subversion going on from the very beginning for the very nature of filmmaking, which is based on subjective choices. And the title of the film, Manufactured Landscapes, suggests to me a reflectiveness, perhaps a self-reflectiveness that relates back to the editorial choices. The landscapes we see are not simply manufactured by industrialization, but manufactured by filmmakers' choices and by editors' choices to present not necessarily a polemical perspective, but at least the subjective perspective of those individuals who are collecting those information. The perspective that said, this is what we see as important or noteworthy or engaging. And so, without going too much further than that, I don't want to seem to be disparaging the film. I thought it was beautifully done and provocative. But it was, for me, the strength was its complexity, whether intended or not.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a bit, in that I did think it was a wee bit disingenuous for him to keep claiming that he was not trying to comment upon these kind of spaces, when of course he is. He's doing a TED talk for one thing, so which is about what world changing. You don't get to go up there without world changing ideas. And on top of that, he's really kind of speaking with and engaging in this landscape tradition, this art tradition that's about sort of Edenic narratives of nature, right? And he's presenting another one that is this industrial landscape. And so clearly just doing that is a form of critique in lots of ways. What I was super interested in was my own, and I would love to hear what other people thought, was there's so many tensions going on in this film, and I was so interested how when I saw his images, the still images, they are so beautiful. They're so beautiful that they seem to lose their power in some ways. They're just too beautiful. And that when I was watching the video footage, which was or it seemed like video, I don't know, a little grainier movement, it had a different feel, and it felt much more powerful as a form of sort of representation that was critical. And I thought, can images of waste and etc. get to be just too aesthetically pleasing, so that they actually lose their power? And I just thought they were too pretty. And they lost. I mean, I was thinking about all those people who are, dying of blood poisoning, and whose children are like dying of blood poisoning, and all of that pain that goes with that life is lost in these images.
Well, it's interesting that we're discussing a narrative. I didn't find a lot of narrative actually in the film. I think the film is, I'm assuming, largely meant to evoke an emotional response, which it did with me, certainly. And it's also interesting how Michael was talking about the subjective choices, because it's actually a documentary, it's a film about a photographer. So there's kind of two levels of choices being made. There's the photographer's choices of the stills he's making, and then there's the documentarian's choice of which films to, which photographs to sort of represent him taking pictures of. But my sort of expertise is as a geographer, so I don't have sort of the background of deconstruction or literary analysis or film analysis, but I do study landscape change, and what struck me about this is sort of this, I would say, as far as intensity of land use, he was capturing in those images the most intense sort of land use changes that we've wrought upon the earth. Not necessarily in the sense of how much land has been consumed. I mean, for that, we would have to probably say agricultural land use. But as far as the intensity of land use, and I'm actually surprised, and maybe this is because this was made a little while ago, but the tar sands of Alberta would have been a great place to film as far as just the massive denuding of the landscape and the large swaths of destruction out there. But yeah, so speaking as a geographer, which is really the only hat I think I can justify wearing, I found it disturbing to, because I deal with these facts and figures all the time, but now here is the actual imagery of the facts and figures. And I think sometimes that's helpful in our work, to not always simply rely on the facts and figures, but an emotional response. And in fact, there's been some writing up of this recently I've seen floating around as far as how the need to bring some more emotion into environmental research, it could be necessary to fulfill it.
That's a great point, Jeff. As you were talking, I was thinking about the psychological cleansing that takes place when you put most of the film in China and show it to a Western audience, and then we're not as culpable. We have a distance that allows us to judge those people and still not feel guilty ourselves. So I thought that's an excellent way of catching out what they're doing.
But Laura, why don't you find a picture beautiful? Those were beautiful.
No, I did find it beautiful.
Right, I know. But you said, but then you felt guilty for finding them beautiful.
I didn't feel guilty. I guess I just, I love them. I thought, oh, I'd put those up in my house, right?
Yeah, the contrast in it
They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. They look like these beautiful 1970s kind of earth art movements. They're just lovely. But that's what I wondered. Like, you go to a gallery and you see them and you think they're lovely, and what else do you think? Do they still work to make us sort of think about these post-industrial landscapes in ways that perhaps we should be thinking about them? I don't know.
Why shouldn't we, though? I mean, what's wrong with a post-industrial landscape? I mean, some people may see some people may see, some people see a valley, right? Like a soil-strewn valley as as like dirty. Something that needs to be, wow, there's a lot of trees there. We could get, take those down and make this place a little. We could bring civilization to the wilderness.
Someone looked at this place and they saw a future runway. And someone looked at that, Charles Perry, and saw a future FIU. And so...
Who knows who's looking at it now?
In fact, I do think those are beautiful places. And as an anthropologist, this big dichotomy he's making between pure nature and wilderness, and which is so clear, and then like these human spaces, seem unhelpful and boring.
This is something that kind of caught my attention too, in that I think we take these examples of extreme land use, to use your term, Jeff, and one of the standard narratives that we usually place these in is that we should be appalled. That should be our emotional response. We should look at this and say, my God, this is, we're raping the land, we're destroying the earth in order to pull these things out of it. And by making them kind of aesthetically beautiful pictures, that kind of deadens or changes that response of horror or disgust or dismay. And you start saying, well gosh, trash is beautiful. And then maybe one of the ways that goes is then you start saying, well, I don't have to feel guilty about it, because it's another way of looking and appreciating a landscape. It's symmetrical. It has lines. It gets played around with in different ways, it has just generally appealing shapes. So that sense of culpability or that sense of responsibility gets transformed in maybe ways that could be problematic or could be beneficial depending on your perspective by making these kind of uses of the land aesthetic judgments as well, or invite aesthetic judgments.
I think the fact that
I'm sorry.
the artist's images are so beautiful would invite a lot of people to look at something that they may not otherwise be interested in looking at. They might be interested in avoiding, even though they know, they might either consciously or subconsciously know that their actions have effects. They might not want to see that, but because the images are beautiful, it's attracting a whole different demographic audience. So be forced to
You're
look at it.
absolutely right, and that's definitely one of the things I was thinking about, this kind of tension about how I felt that suddenly these landscapes that are invisible to most of us are made visible, and that's really cool.
And yet, as Michael said, we are culpable in their creation, though.
Yeah.
We are part of that
I keep
creation.
thinking about that scene in the coal field where the government official does not want them to take pictures, and one of the filmmakers says, "We're going to make this beautiful. Don't worry." And I thought that was just a lie. But from the conversation, I wonder if anybody agrees, if it is.
I thought that was like the key, I was like, yeah, that's what he does,
That they believe it.
What do the
That they
Chinese think
really
of the
feel
finished
that
product?
that's what they're doing.
Does anybody know what the Chinese government thinks of the finished product? I'm curious.
I doubt they care.
I don't know. I was actually very surprised that they got away with it. I remember watching 60 Minutes just a few months ago, where they followed this, where they, I don't know who it was, one of the reporters goes to this recycling center where they're using mercury to melt down these motherboards to extract gold. The cancer rate is sky high, and they got jumped by all these people who live there because it's not supposed to be seen. So now this wasn't quite as quite of an expose as that was, but I was very surprised that they talked their way into and out of that situation where they actually got to
Yeah,
go
that's
to giant piles of trash. I honestly don't know how he did it.
Well, I would agree with Laura. I think Edward Brzezinski's, as a photographer, his main motivation is to make these beautiful. Outside of his motive for why he wants them to be appealing to people, aside from obviously being well known as a photographer, I'm not sure. But I thought what the documentary did that the photographs don't is take the people that you see in those images, which in his images become part of the manufacturer's landscape. You can argue that on our flyer with people lined up in the opening scene, they're as much a part of the landscape and therefore dehumanized as the buildings or anything else. But what I thought the film did, which was interesting, and it's coming to a question for all of you, is humanize that by showing in the beginning, when you have that long shot with no voiceover of the factory workers, and then you see them lined up sort of outside, and they're being not berated, but they're being, scolded very sternly for their production and what they haven't been doing correctly. And it's sort of something that's repeated throughout the film when you get these one-on-ones with the actual workers in the factories. You have the one that they ask, "Are you proud of what you do?" And he says, "Well, no, it's a job. I'm doing it for the government." And so my question for all of you, there seems to be throughout the entire film this tension between the Chinese government's desire to grow, right? And there are people in the film who say our lives have become better because of this. But then you also have the other side, which is the reality of the land limits, and then also the reality of the actual impact on life standards, especially of the workers. So what is, I don't know if I can ask you what is the solution, because that's a huge question. But in what ways is China approaching this differently than we did? And in what ways does the film sort of help kind of tease out? Because I feel like in the same way that it was very alien, we can be others and sort of judge the situation. At the same time, there were very real, the moments when they go through making that iron, and then you see it in the recycling heap, that resonates with a Western viewer. Everyone uses an iron. So what ways, I guess, did you see, does this film offer an answer, or does it in any way demonstrate a problem, I guess, that you encounter in your research?
well, okay. Well, one thing that it does illustrate is this choice that in a perfect world nobody would have to make, which is between poverty and poison. So, a lot of that e-waste that's flowing through there is coming from here. So we were
From universities.
Yes, from universities. So we discussed this idea of culpability and stuff. Even though we are not suffering from the disamenities of those landscapes, we are helping produce them. And watching movies like this, we have to kind of confront the excesses of our consumptive lifestyle. And that can be uncomfortable. It's interesting, I didn't get beauty from it, maybe because I go through all these facts and figures and I'm so used to the bad news, I'm like, yes, these are illustrations of the bad news that I talk about in class. So the beauty was lost on me, but I applaud him for trying, I suppose. But maybe it's just me. I don't know, but for me it was disturbing because when I see cloud, all that dusty air, I think of what's in it, and people are inhaling it, people are getting cancer, and so it's hard for me to forget about that. When they say, people here are dying before 30, it's hard for me to forget about that and just focus on the photo. But as far as solutions, I don't have any simple ones. So I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar on the transition from, the agrarian economy in China to this industrial economy. It's certainly what people who are scholars about China and about the environmental injustice of this kind of labor say is that it's very similar, right, to 19th century industrialization in America and Europe in terms of this dichotomy or this bad choice between poison and a wage, right? I'm not sure how much the film does humanize the people. It seemed, I felt like it was just kind of this cog in the machine, sort of. I was thinking about Marx a lot when I was looking at those images, because, the humans become animated when the video is going, but they still are just labor.
Except for the Chinese Martha Stewart.
Except for the Chinese Martha Stewart, but they're just embodiment of labor, right? And they're not. We don't know anything about what they love. We don't know what they think about nature. We don't know anything about what they believe in.
There's no
or
talking.
their children or anything. So it's a very mono sort of image of the human in the manufactured landscape.
I think the filmmaker is always struggling against oversimplification as well. At several points in the film, I thought of those magazine photos of Sally Struthers surrounded by starving children. Well, none of us is in favor of children starving. No one is in favor of pollution. But the opportunity to say, this is what we have to do to relieve pollution. This is the trade-off. This is what we must give up. Was just never taken up, and I understand the desire to remain objective, to at least to draw back from being ideological or political, but the difficulty of slipping into simplistic images is really a challenge, and I don't think the filmmaker always met that challenge. But I agree with you that the scenes where they showed the beauty of the landscape, the industrialized landscape, I think were a way of making the film more complex and not allowing me simply to say this is bad and this is good.
Did anyone on the panel ever see a film with a similar theme, with a strange name, Koyanis Kwatsi? We're informed in the film that it's Inuktitut, which is Eskimo language, for a life out of balance. Did anyone on the panel, Jeff?
I've seen it
How would you
once,
compare
a while. I saw it a long time ago. So I do know that, I do remember it's a series of a lot of images. I don't remember lots of exposition in it, if I recall correctly. Is that
There was
correct?
no dialogue. It was
Yes,
all music,
okay, yeah.
and rather bombastic.
Yeah. I do remember it being somewhat similar, but I haven't seen it recently enough to draw more sort of distinct
I haven't seen it. What did you think? Did you?
Well, I don't want to digress on this if no one has seen it, because it's a pointless thing. It would be worth. All I can say is it would be worthwhile to see it, compare it to this film.
I want to see it again. I haven't seen it.
So is it better to have people recycling e-waste or not?
Well, that's not the only way to do it.
No,
I
it's
mean-
not the only way to do it.
So, I mean, there are safe, controlled ways to do it, and so.
And where do those safe, controlled ways generate? Do they generate from the organic agrarian landscape, or do they generate from the technologically advanced portion of society?
I mean, where is that work conducted?
No, where does this ideas of, well, creating the computer and then recycling the computer in ecologically or human health, the human health technology for maintaining a high life expectancy, which, yes, it's probably terrible for those folks, but, poor Chinese folks were dying of cholera 30 years ago, right? We weren't living this long anyway. I mean, you know what I'm saying? We exchanged one risk of early, of a short longevity for another.
Well, we didn't.
Somewhat, maybe.
I mean, I think
That's
that's the
starting to
point.
turn a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, maybe it's not where the idea about how to do things in a cleaner, safer way comes from. It's about who's willing to pay the higher price for those products. I mean, we know how to do that, but we are already paying, I'm already paying $1,000 for the Apple computers that I love so dearly and all the technology that I use. And so I think that the knowledge about that is one thing, but it's about, global markets.
Right, but here, the thing is so we have the technological abilities to create or to maintain some version of standard of living. It's just it doesn't transcend to 7 billion people.
If not
Would
everyone
we
can live
have-
like us.
Would we have a sustainable, high-end, economically viable society at 1 billion people?
At 1 billion?
Yeah.
I mean, could everyone live like us if it was just 1 billion of us? Could everyone live
We'd
like?
probably live better.
I suppose so. I mean, I don't know, but one thing that I've been reading about quite a few times now is that with the number of people there are today, certainly not everyone. There's simply not enough resources for everyone to have the same sort of excessive consumption of energy and resources as Americans. So talk about culpability, and for us to judge others, saying you shouldn't want to live like us, and yet continue living the way we do, puts us in an embarrassing position.
Well, anyone who says we shouldn't live like we do
Yeah.
gets ridiculed.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
by our leaders.
Yeah.
But from an aesthetic standpoint, the transitions in the film from black and white to color I thought were interesting and called my attention. And often the transitions would include a black and white photograph, and then might move to black and white video, and then to color. But one of the things that the black and white reminded you of, the black and white photographs also reminded you of, if you're old enough, is our photos post-World War II of people in rubble,
Yeah.
standing in rubble and going through rubble and looking through things. Their world has been destroyed, and it was a black and white world. And so there's this connection across, across the years. I thought that was sort of interesting.
Yeah, it did look like that.
Mhm.
I thought so, too.
That dehumanizing aspect that Elaine was talking about, I very much agree with that.
Congratulations for the poster, by the way. That was a very intelligent choice of photo for the poster.
Well, as far as dehumanization, I noticed in the factory not a word was spoken. Everyone had to maintain complete silence. And I can't imagine the work is mind-numbing as it is, but if you're forbidden to even talk to your neighbor, that's pretty dehumanizing. And then the idea that you have to tear down your own house and destroy, obliterate the place where you've lived and where you've had an impact on the landscape, I thought the psychological aspect of that would be difficult to understand.
Well, even the opening of the factory, going from row to row to row, it was so goddamn boring. But it
An
catches.
aesthetic success.
This is what it's like to work for 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day. You're going to be just as bored. But I couldn't help asking myself, all right, I get it, fine, now to what end? what is the direction that the film wants to go? And I agree with you about the narrative was very, I think there was a narrative, or there were multiple narratives, but there wasn't an overarching unity. And that doesn't mean that they had to have a political position, but for me, there needed to be some connection between the different images besides pollution is bad and sometimes recycling is good unless you're burning motherboards.
You know, we have this thing though, like I saw that, and that factory is a very efficient and productive place.
Mm-hmm.
You saw it?
I mean,
On the film. Okay, right. All right.
no, but
Okay,
I worked in
okay.
some big, I worked in a GM plant that was a mile long. And I loaded trucks on a dock in Bridgeport, Chicago. That thing was a half a mile long. You know, so it's my APS finger. So, you know, I mean, it's in actually there's something kind of liberating by mind-numbing work. If you're, you know, to a scholar, manual labor, that's a charity.
I could watch it for hours.
But the idea, you know, one of the things is that, you know, is it better to have this, like, this really intense human construct if you were to, you know, have human construct, maybe some small buffer zone, and then wildland? You know, these ideas of taking Shanghai and building it up into big, tall skyscrapers, I think that's a great idea. The worst thing is to have, you know, to go from here to downtown Miami on one-story buildings.
The model was
Right?
asked
It's like-
touch too.
Like, do you know what I'm saying? It's
Mhm.
almost like
Yeah.
we don't leave room because everything's got this like half. We've got this half mentality. Like, okay, I want to live in a city, but I want my own trees in my own backyard, my own space with my fence around it, and so I'm going to have, you know, a 10,000 square foot lot. Well, really, if you live in a city, you should live in, you know, 800 square foot apartment
Mhm.
somewhere, and then leave the rest of the land to do its thing, its biogeochemical, ecological functioning thing, right? And it's kind of that. So this the dichotomy that this movie maybe showed a bit. I don't think that I don't necessarily want to say that I kind of appreciate the intensity of the urban. You know, because I could, if we were balanced, we would have the intensity of the non-developed also.
Mm.
We
But
have
that's a
this
great
kind of-
point. With those long shots of Shanghai, made the 2- and 3-story dwellings look very, very idyllic and romantic in comparison to the sterile skyscrapers until you came in close, and then they were just slums.
Yeah.
The real healthy places were the skyscrapers.
Right.
And where else would you put an additional 4 million people?
Although when that happens in China, because it happens in Beijing, those traditional housing,
Mhm.
it's not like those poor people move into the skyscrapers.
That's right.
They're
That was clear.
displaced.
That was
Yeah.
clear.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and so I mean, that is one of the problems with that kind of.
He handled the transitions between the idealized model and the real city and back again. That also was something that was.
So why the old lady in the high skyscraper? She's the one who didn't want to move, so when she's still there?
She's just holding, hanging out the staircase doing her knitting. I think too that cities are really are also places of nature, right? And so we know that, you know, urban ecology tells us that there's incredible amounts of diversity and interesting things that happen in cities, and so it's not like there's cities and then there's nature,
Mhm.
you know.
No, but I think the demand that cities and civilization put on geographically, you know,
They're different.
they are different, but it's this like inefficient loss of function that comes from low density, right? A road that carries 100 people a day on it still covers the same impermeable surface than a road the same size that would carry 1,000 people a day.
There's definitely better ways to do it.
Yeah.
Your comments kind of remind me of something I think that Portland practices, and I think that they call it, although I might be misremembering the term, the Portland Industrial Zone, which delimits a space around the city of Portland and says that industrial construction can only happen within these regions. And one of the reasons behind that concept is, I guess, to prevent the idea of urban sprawl, just kind of reaching out endlessly. So you can get from kind of the Portland downtown city center to forested regions in about 20 minutes, as opposed to 2 hours or 3 hours if you get in LA or something. Yeah. And
We have an urban
so-
development boundary,
yeah.
but
Ours is very porous.
Yes, yes.
We actually want to look into that.
But it also kind of made me think with the idealized future of Shanghai is where is that division going to be between the city boundaries and all of these urban constructed landscapes of waste that we're also seeing in the film? How close are they going to be together? How are they going to be joined together? And what are the kind of the issues of that kind of proximity, or avoiding that kind of proximity too, putting the industrial regions way out from where people are living so that they can be hidden.
You know, this movie also reminds me of a bit of a debate we had in the department. Len might remember this. Not too long ago, I read an article in, I don't know, National Geographic or something, where they said, where they're saying it's now the age of the Anthropocene. Was it Paul Crutzen said, Holocene's over, it's the age of the Anthropocene. So I emailed the department to see what they thought, and I got quite a few responses. A lot of people had a lot of strong thoughts about it. But essentially, geologists are not easily impressed by changes that people have wrought upon the Earth, saying the Earth doesn't even notice. We'll come and go, the Earth won't even notice. But now, even geologists are starting to step back and say maybe we will be in the geologic record. The incredible increase in CO2, the monocultures of pollen, the huge changes in pollen, the coral reef record. I mean, I'm a geographer, not a geologist, but this movie kind of brings that home. For me, this is kind of the tip of the sword right here, even though they don't really talk about elevated CO2, although that's certainly implied in all that coal combustion, or the pollen record, or the coral reef record. But that's something interesting that scientists are kind of talking about. And the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, NSF, is now kind of embraced the Anthropocene, that the Holocene is over. And there's a session coming up at the ASM, which it's something about the Anthropocene. So this idea that it's not just environmental alarmism or something like that, that scientists are actually saying this is going to be in the record a million years from now, millions of years from now. What we have done will be in the record. Maybe 100 years ago it wouldn't have been true, but there are now a lot of people. And I'm interested.
The 6th grade extinction.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, and there was
in
debate.
Geological history.
Yes.
The fossils of the future will be much fewer in genetic diversity after the age of man.
Yeah, but I remember your response. You said you used to not subscribe to that, but that now you're starting to.
Mostly from the levels of biological
Yeah.
change.
Do we have any other questions?
It was very thought-provoking film.
Thank you
We
so
gave you a
much.
small group.